Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Crafting a Short Story Collection. And joining me on the show to cover this topic is Michael Goodwin Hilton. Hey, Michael.
Hi, thanks for having me, Demi.
Of course. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fabulous. I'm so excited you're joining me on the show today to chat all about short story collections and more. But before we dive into our chat, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey as an author so far.
Well, first and foremost, I consider myself primarily a dramatist. I mean, I've been a writer in one way or another most of my life, since I would say early childhood. But I think writing, when I kind of discovered the craft of playwriting in high school, that's when my identity as a writer kind of really crystallized, and it's what I basically majored in college, and it's what it's sort of been my primary mode and genre of writing for most of my writing life, and so that's kind of where I begin is as a playwright, as a dramatist. And a little over 10 years ago, I came to Europe. I won't get too much into the details, but suffice to say, I came over first as to do some volunteer work, and then I met my wife, and she's German, and so I came to Germany in 2012, actually. And around that time, after I moved to Europe, I was continuing to work on plays and also working on a couple of novels. But I discovered the short story around that time. I mean, I'd read many short stories up, until then, before then, I should say. But I would say around that time, I kind of started really paying attention to the short story form um, in a very different way. I became very enamored of the form, and yeah, I just really kind of fell in love with it, and I started writing short stories then as a way of practicing a type of writing that until that point I hadn't been particularly accustomed to. And yeah, there was a lot of trial and error along the way, but it was very challenging in a way that writing plays. It was challenging in different ways, I should say. I mean, writing plays has its own set of challenges, but they're a bit different from the challenges of writing prose generally and short stories specifically. And I was very excited by that. I was excited by that sense of being challenged by a form that I wasn't very familiar with, and yeah, and just really exploring through, and of course reading as many short stories as I could from authors that I loved and who really shaped me along the way. And long story short, sorry, that's a really long answer to your question, but that's kind of how I ended up, my journey from being a playwright and then being a playwright and a short story writer, and that's sort of where I see myself right now, especially. Yeah.
That's fabulous. Well, I love how you embrace the challenge. I think it's really interesting because if you look at different kinds of writing, you can do poetry, you can write plays, you can write screenplays, you can write
Right.
short stories, novels. I'm a songwriter as well, and I write music. And so
Yeah.
they all are similar in the sense that you're telling some kind of story and capturing some kind of emotion, but they all require different skills. And I think it's really great as authors to try different types of writing because it definitely allows you to explore different skills, and you may try something that you've never done before and find that you really
Hmm.
like it, like you did with short stories.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it really opened me up as a writer, and pushed me in new directions, and yeah, I've really grown a lot through that. Yeah, through exploring that form as well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so, what was the moment when because you're writing short stories and you're reading a lot of them to
Yeah.
understand short stories, what was the moment when you actually decided to pursue the path of seeing if you can get your short stories published?
I'd had a lot of short stories written, and I've sent them out semi regularly, I suppose, over the past decade or so. But honestly, I mean, not that much. I mean, in other words, I was I was gaining some confidence as a short story writer. Also, I was part of a writers group in Stuttgart, Germany for a long time, and I developed a lot of stories as part of the group, and I performed some in front of an audience. So I was getting a sense of myself as a story writer, but I knew that I still had I knew that I still needed to develop, and I knew that some stories were I thought at the time pretty in good shape, but then I knew that others were still a work in progress. So I wasn't submitting that regularly. And then what happened a few years ago? I mean, really in 2020 during the pandemic, kind of in the within the first few months. I was at the time I was preparing for a to teach a playwriting course. I teach at a college here in Germany, and I was preparing for a workshop, playwriting workshop that I was going to teach for the first time in the summer. And as part of preparing for that workshop, I was doing exercises, writing exercises from a book to explore which ones would be useful in the workshop. And the book that I was using primarily is this book called The 3 a.m. Epiphany by Brian Kitely. A lot of creative writing exercises in there, and I was doing some of those myself just to get a feeling for them. And and there's one exercise in particular that I was doing, and it was basically writing a character's entire life pretty much within like a page or within like a very compressed uh, space, right? And I did that exercise, and it's very hard to describe, and I'm gonna this is gonna start to get a bit I don't know exactly what, but a little bit abstract, I suppose. I did the exercise, and then I was kind of if I felt like something had broken through, and suddenly I could almost I mean, it's a cliche, right, to say that the floodgates opened, right? But that was really sort of how it felt. It really felt like from one moment to the next, suddenly all of these stories were just there. Were just there. They were just in my mind, sort of from one moment to the next. Um, and at first, I thought, oh well, that's exciting. Like these are new stories that I'm gonna try to figure out how to tell. And what I realized within I don't know exactly, a period of days or maybe weeks, I realized, no, wait a minute, they're not exactly new stories that have come to me at this point, but they're basically the endings of stories that I'd already written years before. In other words, a lot of those earlier stories that I'd worked on within the previous 10 years or so, it was like I suddenly realized how to finish them. I mean, some of them I could still more or less salvage in the condition that they were, but most of them I had to kind of really renovate. And that was kind of, and so I that's what I was work that was the project that became What the Statue Thinks. And so I worked on those stories for I can't say exactly. I mean, at least 6 months or so. I would work on them in the evenings after I was done with work, and I had a, a small son at the time. And once he was in bed, which takes sometimes quite a while, so once I finally had some time to myself in the evening, I would work on these stories, and I think I did that for at least half a year or so, reworking the earlier drafts I'd had for many years before. And yeah, and then I ended up eventually with a complete draft of 12 stories, and including one that didn't make the final cut. I sent an early draft to a friend of mine, JD Campbell, who's also a really great writer. And part of her feedback was that the one story that it was kind of like a satire, it was kind of a satirical monologue. And she basically said, well, this one doesn't really quite work in this collection. I said, you know what, you're absolutely right. So I took it out, and it ended up being the 11 stories that would, yeah, become What the Statue Thinks. Yeah.
Perfect. So you mentioned a lot of things I definitely want to dig deeper into. But the first
You,
thing
you can
is
you can always you
that
can always stop me if I'm
oh,
going
no,
on
no, no,
too
you're
long.
perfect. No, no, no. Lots of things, lots of things. So
Yeah,
I love how you kind of were exploring prompts that sparked
yeah,
inspiration for you.
yeah,
And for me, like I write young adult novels, but I do write short stories to submit to
yeah,
anthologies. And I think that's a really cool thing with short stories. Sometimes they're hard to think of on your own. Like if I just wanted to sit down and write a short story today, it would be a little difficult for me to think of something to come up with. Versus whenever I'm like looking at anthologies and things, they have the prompts for you. Like, oh, we're looking for a reimagining of blah blah blah, or we're we're looking for this genre or this age category or like some kind of guideline. And I find it's really fun to write the prompts because it definitely gives you the opportunity to write something that you may not have thought of on your own. And I also love how this gave you ways of finishing stories you already started. I think that's really cool. How you had things started and maybe needed some more time with it, and then you got the ideas for that. But one of the other things you said that I really liked was, writing concisely. I think that as novelists like me, I write long, long, long books, and then it's like, oh wait, I need to write a short story in 3,000 words. Okay, see how this
Right.
goes. And I
Right.
think short stories is a really great way to write like succinctly and to say what you need to say in an impactful way and the fewest
Yeah.
words possible. So it's definitely
Yeah.
a good
For
skill
sure.
to have as a
For
writer.
sure. And to make hard choices, right? I mean,
Right.
that's also, I mean, I mean, a lot of the stories, a number of the stories in the collection were much, I mean, some of them are quite lengthy, and some of those are even lengthier originally. And I had to make, I with some of the stories, I had to make a very, I had to remove a lot, right? A lot of the backstory that had been there, and I decided to myself, a lot of this backstory, it's still there, right? It's still true of the story. It's still part of the reality of that story. It's just not. It's true of the story. It's just not necessarily true of the page, right? It doesn't. It can be there, kind of in the background, in a more suggestive, perhaps more atmospheric way, but it doesn't have to necessarily be there, in print. And the reader is just going to have, will hopefully be able to perceive the depth of that back. If I've done my job right, if I've done the, I
Right.
mean, I'm thinking specifically of the first story in the collection, "A Hole in the Water," which is one of the longest stories in the collection, but it was even much longer before because it included a lot of background information from the main character's childhood and everything. And basically really took most of that out. And yeah, and had to trust that the depth of the story would speak for itself, so to speak. So yeah, you do have to make a lot of these really hard choices, which is, part of the challenge. But once you can appreciate how much a single sentence or two sentences or three sentences, once you get a feeling for that muscle, you just feel like a fitter storyteller. I don't know. It's kind of
Right.
like working out, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
total sense. It's the line level writing and editing.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
it's really important to go line by line because you're exactly like you can't have all the backstory. You can't have all the sentences that maybe you had in the draft if you're trying to get it down. And
Yeah.
my friend and I actually co-wrote a short story that we submitted to an anthology. And
Mhm.
when we were editing it, I am not
Yeah.
even exaggerating. We were on the phone and we took turns reading it aloud. And we would literally go line by line and say, is that
Yeah.
word needed? Is this sentence even needed? Can the reader
Yeah.
infer this on their own? Like, do we need to spell it out for them? And so,
Yeah.
line level writing is really important. And the other thing, too, is there are authors who had a short story and then developed it into a full length novel.
Right.
Can
For
you see
sure.
yourself doing that with any of these?
I, this is the welcome to the questions that bounce around in my mind, every every hour of every day. I've been kind of tearing my hair out about this very question for a long time. I mean, for many years by this point. The question here in this case being, which type of writing am I going to really knuckle down and pursue and earn it, right? So in other words, am I just going to pursue writing plays, or or am I going to or pursue writing plays and novels, or just plays and short stories, or novels and short stories? I mean, on one hand, it sounds a bit silly because you think, well, just do whatever you want to do, but somehow, I don't know, somehow for me, it's important to kind of be able to, for my own purposes of setting goals and being able to focus and trying to sort of take my writing to the next level. It is important for me to have this kind of degree of intentionality behind it all. So your question, Demi, about whether I would develop a novel from any of these stories, I think about it very actively. I would say that the stories in the collection as such at this point, I do consider those complete. Um, I really, and part of what I'm very proud of this collection is that I really think I was able to say everything. I was able to really tell those stories, those 11 stories, as 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 well as I possibly could. I mean, and I don't know whether but just from my own perspective, regardless of what anyone thinks about them, just from my own, like I can look at myself in the mirror and say, I couldn't have told those stories in a more honest, more truthful, more necessary way, and that's really that has to be where it begins and ends for every writer, right? So I really feel like those particular stories are finished basically, and I think that project is finished. It does occur to me though that there's other stories that I have that I could potentially imagine a novel growing out of. And the answer to your question, Demi, is that the jury is kind of still out on that. I don't think that I'm a novelist. I mean, I've written a couple of novels, and in fact, a couple of my early novels I wrote in my early 20s. A lot of that, some of that substance has been filtered into what the statue thinks. In other words, some of the even a few of the individual lines from my earliest attempt at a novel, and a few of the scenes as well, made their way into some of those stories as well. So I was kind of able to channel a lot of that very early work. But I do entertain the idea of writing a novel, perhaps, and really the jury's out. At present I'm perhaps leaning a bit more toward possibly of continuing my playwriting first and foremost, and maybe borrowing some things from some of my stories to develop in some full length plays. But then I could wake up tomorrow and say, "Oh, you know what? I'm instead gonna write a novel." You know what I mean? Like, I really am kind of going back and forth in my head a lot about this at present. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I like how you are confident that you did what you wanted to do with this collection.
Yeah,
And for you, it's done. And
yeah,
so you definitely don't have to. I was just super curious because there are authors
yeah,
who do that. And I
yeah,
think for
yeah,
me, like there's a short story I wrote called Jabria Shadows that's going to be in an anthology next year. And it's a reimagining of Death's Messengers, which is a Brothers Grimm tale. And I just love Jabria's character. And so it's more of like I could see myself possibly writing like a dark fantasy, like a YA dark fantasy with her character that's not like an extension of the story, but like take her character and do something different with her. So it's more of that kind of thing. But there's a lot of things that we can do with our short stories. But I love how you feel confident this one's complete. And
yeah,
another question I had was something you pointed out earlier, how there was a short story you had that just didn't seem to fit the collection, so you left it out. And I totally feel that with my music because when I'm doing albums, there can be songs that I really love, but it just doesn't fit on the project. And so I know that you left that one out, but when you were going through and really deciding which stories to include, how did you go about finalizing that decision and also to put the stories in order for the collection?
yeah. This year, the first question, how did I decide which ones would fit together? It was important to me that all the stories were connected by a strong sense of place, right? So I mean, part of the collection is I would say part of the character of the collection is has to do with the setting, right? They're all Most of the stories are set at the Jersey Shore, which is basically where I'm from. A couple of them, one of them takes place in upstate New York, and one of them takes place in New York City. But New Jersey, even in those stories, New Jersey is kind of waving in the background, so to speak. They're very New Jersey, and more specifically, very Jersey Shore centered stories. And so part of the consideration of which ones to choose were the ones that were just the most naturally connected to that environment, but also maybe revealing something a little bit different about it, right? So each story would be kind of looking at that looking at that area from another perspective, whether it was another um, uh, uh, social perspective, another economic perspective, right? Another kind of class perspective, or some of the stories are a little bit. One of the stories is maybe even a touch more surreal than the other. So kind of just measure appreciating that area where I'm from the viewpoint of these very very different people, right? These very different characters in these different stories, but nevertheless there is this tie that binds, right? There is this kind of through line that is very much connected to the place itself. And I would so that was one important factor. And I suppose the other one had to do with the you know the I mean, I'm shying a little bit away from the word genre. Because, I mean, I'm tempted to say that the ones that they're they're social. If you had to put them in a category, I would suppose you could put them under the category of social realism. I'm I suppose I don't know. I didn't really I don't sit down and say, okay, well, now I'm going to write a social realist story or a social realist play. I, but I suppose that's how you would consider them. Anyway, but the stories, it seemed that they were echoing off each other the most clearly. So I think the ones that were most similar in terms of tone, for example. Yeah, and and then your follow up question. Um, Help me out. Sorry, help me out. What was your follow up question,
Yeah,
Demi?
so it was, how did you decide what order you wanted to put them in?
So the order was purely intuitive in terms of which one. I mean, I consciously decided that the title story should be the very last story in the collection. I mean, that's fairly conventional. But beyond that, uh, I don't know. There was an intuitive logic to how I ordered the stories. I liked. I mean, I did try to think a little bit in terms of the arc of the book. I mean, even though each, a collection is something very different than a novel or a play, right? It's not a continuous narrative, but at the same time, I mean, at least the collections that I respond to the most, there is some sense of a journey there is some sense of an arc. So I was conscious of that. In other words, I wanted the reader to have a feeling of starting the book, ending the book in a different place than they started it, right? That there's been some degree of evolution, some degree of change, even though each story itself is separate from the one before and the one after it. And so that's what I mean, that was what I consciously wanted to accomplish. And the order and how I ordered the stories to try to accomplish that was pretty intuitive, right? In other words, I mean, the first couple of stories, I would say the first two, yeah, the first two or three stories, I think, are probably perhaps some of the bleakest, right, in the collection. And I mean, they've all got that. Most of them have that element one way or another. But to my mind, anyway, the later stories, like the first two stories, are among the bleakest, and perhaps the last two are a bit different, right? There's a little bit more, I think, a bit more hope. There's a bit more of a sense of a feeling of of redemption, or at least characters who are awakening to parts of themselves that they didn't even really quite know they were there. So I don't know. That was, I mean, that was one sense of an arc that I had for the book itself. And I got positive feedback. I mean, my friend JD Campbell, who I mentioned before, also in her initial feedback of my early draft of the collection, she commented specifically on that they were ordered well. I think how she explained it was that the stories moved from strength to strength, and I didn't quite. I kind of just could feel what she meant. I couldn't quite explain it, but I just sort of knew what she was getting at, and I think I agreed. So that, yeah, if that, yeah, that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's perfect. And
yeah,
I love how the collection as a whole has an arc. I think that's really important. And I take the exact same approach when I'm putting my track list together for my
yeah.
albums, because
That,
each
sure.
song is its own song. But if a listener listens from the first track to the last track, there should be an evolution, there should be a
I mean, the
journey.
album. I mean, the album is a great example. I mean, the album really, I believe in the album as a form, right? In other words, Um, I hope that musicians like yourself, I hope that people don't give up on the album, right, in favor of just the single, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I feel like the albums that I've loved most of my life, and the albums that I think really have, meant the greatest, have
Mm,
have just really impacted culture in
yeah.
huge ways, have been kind of novelistic in a sense, right? There has been a sense of that it ends in a place very different from the other. I mean, let's yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah.
tons of examples, but the one that like Kendrick Lamar, right? I mean,
Right,
his
right.
albums have this kind of literary, there's a lot of there's a highly literary quality to at least some of his most recent work, and so you really do get a sense of that it has there's a kind of climax and these kind of these narrative storytelling elements. So so I agree with you. I think that
Yeah.
albums that are in that way can be very powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so it's really fun for me to pick the
Yeah.
track list and put the order
Yeah.
together, and
Yeah.
I like agonize over it like for so long, and then once I submit it for distribution, it's like you can't change it now.
Yeah, sure.
So whenever you got what the statue thing signed by Wild Ink, how did that feel?
Yeah. It was just great. I mean, I was so thrilled. I really didn't have much hope. I mean, look, I'm not a well-known author yet, right? I mean, I'm an emerging author, and and I know that, and I already knew that shopping around a short story collection, especially as an emerging author, is a very is an uphill battle, to say the least. I mean, it's those, there's not that many publishers who would go for something like that these days. I don't think, unless you've got a lot of hype around you. Um, and I mean, I just really took it. So I wasn't shopping it around that much because the truth is, I just didn't really have that much hope. I mean, I believed in the work. I knew that the work was there. um, I just didn't realistically. It was hard for me to imagine it really being of interest to any publishers. And with respect to Abby, I came across her on Twitter in some thread, in some author thread. There was, I forget exactly what she was responding to, but basically, in her comment, she mentioned that she had this new publishing company, and and how did she put it in this very sweet way that the biggest reward is smiling authors, or something like it was. It's this very. And I saw that, I said, oh God, that's someone that I would just adore working with. She just sounds like such an incredible person. And I was right. I mean, I got in touch with her, and she was extremely supportive from the very beginning. And I yeah, and I tried not to get my hopes up too high. I tried to be realistic with my own expectations. Um, and then the email that really, I guess I would say, it changed my life. I mean, it came through and saying, that we love your collection, and we'd like to offer you a publishing deal. And I mean, I could hardly believe it. It was really, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's so great,
Yeah,
and Abby's fantastic, Wild Ink is
yeah,
fantastic, so
yeah,
you're in a fantastic group of
yeah,
authors and
yeah.
people,
No,
so they're
I've
fantastic.
I felt, I mean, Abby and Laura Walkowitz, my editor,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
just great, great, great people. I mean,
Mhm.
really committed. Yeah, it's such a great, scrappy, awesome,
Yeah,
independent press, and
right.
I've just been very happy to be a part of it. Yeah.
Mhm, for sure. So, just to wrap up our chat on the short stories, what advice do you have to any authors who are interested in writing a short story collection?
Just read everything you can possibly get your hands on. I mean, read every kind of short story. Read classics. Read experimental work. I mean, just read comedy, read fantasy, read sci-fi, read literary fiction. Just read everything. um, and for many reasons, obviously, you learn about craft, you learn about storytelling, but also you expand your arsenal, so to speak, right? I mean, you I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think that in my stories, for example, there's maybe like one phrase or one sentence or one moment that, if I were to put a pin next to it, an author's face would come up. Not that I was consciously trying to copy them or something like that, but just that their voice was coming through somehow, in just kind of these very small ways, like just like one, even just like where I would put a comma, right? Like, like things like that. It's like, okay, that comma, that's a I don't know, that's a Claire Vay Watkins. That's where Claire Vay Watkins would put a comma, or that's where John Updike would, insert a semicolon, or that's where I don't know, you know what I mean? Like little things like that. So just read everything. And what else can I say that's maybe a little bit more interesting in terms of uh, you want to make sure that your collection is balanced. You want to make sure that there's a variety of different voices that are available. That they're not only mm, characters who are your age and who look like you and think like you. I mean, there can be that a little bit. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But there should also be a character who's much older or much younger, or from a very different set of circumstances in society.
Fabulous. That is absolutely perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the show. And this brings us to the plot twist, where I get to ask you a fun question that you couldn't have seen coming. And so, your plot twist question is, if you were stranded on an island and had to read the same short story over and over and over again, which one would you pick?
The same short story over and over and over again. Boy, that's a great question. So it would have to be a story that you just love, on every level, in every way. That every time you read it, it also gives you something that you wouldn't have seen before, right? Because you're going to be on that island for a long time, probably, and so you need something that's both reassuring, entertaining, but also nourishing. So okay. So one short story on that island. Um, I'm not even gonna analyze this too much. Just the one that just came into my mind, uh, eh, "The Foghorn" by Ray Bradbury. And I'm not even gonna try to even analyze it further. It just came into my it's just there, so there it is, "The
Okay.
Foghorn" by Ray Bradbury. Yeah.
I haven't read that one. I've read others by him, but not that one. I have to read it.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very haunting. Just a great short story, and one of the and perhaps the reason why my subconscious went to that straight away. One of those. I mean, I read it probably when I was very young, and one of those short stories that you read at a young age that makes you love and notice the short story, right? That you notice that you had an experience of reading this that was very different from the experience of reading a novel, right, or watching a movie. And so yeah, so that was I would say that because that was one of the stories that made me aware of the short story as a very powerful form in and of itself. I'll say that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining me on the show. Can you please share with everybody where they can find you online and check out what the statue thinks?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter. My handle is author MGH. Um, I'm on Substack. I have a Substack where I publish literary fiction and some essays and other works. The Substack is called Little Things. So if you know Michael Goodwin Hilton, Little Things, I'm sure you can find it right away. Um, and I have my plays are also available online, at the New Play Exchange. I think people have to have an account there anyway, but that's where I'm also as well. So Twitter and Substack. And when What the Statue Thinks is available to order via Amazon, and as well as barnesandnoble.com, I believe. And I would really love to share it with as many people as I could. Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much again for joining me on the show.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Demi. It's been really a pleasure.
You're welcome. It has for sure. Listeners, that is a wrap on this chapter with Michael, all about crafting a short story collection. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if your friends in the publishing industry you think would enjoy the show too, please pass it along to them. Thank you for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.